How irredeemable can a superbike be? I am talking about a rusted and corroded Kawasaki Zephyr that had been abandoned since 1992. This thing is in pretty bad shape, and you easily can tell that it has undergone extensive trauma and damage over the years. But today, the restorer will attempt to undo all of that by restoring the motorcycle so that it looks just like it did when it was manufactured over 3 decades ago. Every restoration comes with its own challenges, but for this particular project, the sheer number of problems we need to fix is just enormous. Some parts of the coating have been washed off, the tires are stuck, and more importantly, the seat and some other important components are missing. This makes the restoration even more difficult because aside from fixing the mechanical faults, the restorer might need to replace some of these broken parts. And this isn't exactly an easy thing to do, especially because it's a model from the early 90s. And you really cannot be sure that the parts will be readily available in the market. With that said, I hope that the restorer will find all the necessary spare parts, because if he doesn't, then this whole project might just be dead on arrival, which will be really sad. I mean, the Kawasaki Zephyr is such a special bike. Its vintage design and solid performance made it a cult hero back in the day, and even after all these years, it still has that charm and appeal that every motorcycle enthusiast wants to see in their bike. It's an absolute miracle that we were able to find it, but the big question is, can he really bring this thing back to life? Well, there's only one way to find out. So you might be wondering what's happening here. Well, it's not a big deal. It's essentially putting the bike on a paddock rack in preparation for the disassembly process. Next, the gloves come on, the tools come out, and it's time to disassemble the bike, but not before draining the oil and replacing the oil. Now, I know you're thinking it's probably too early to do this, but trust me, the restorer wasn't breaking any law here. The restorer can decide to change the oil anytime he likes. And it's probably better to do it early because it allows him to concentrate on other things. But just as the restorer was about to do that, the restorer noticed some pretty worrying stuff. The key cylinder is completely missing. However, there's no need to panic because he's got the replacement here. Moving on, the tank was removed, and so was the spark plug and some other accessories attached to the engine. Once this was completed, it was time to do some groundwork before dismantling the engine. This obviously took a while because, as you know, there were a lot of screws and bolts to lose, but eventually the restorer got it done, and he was able to detach the engine, albeit with the help of a winch. In case you didn't know, a winch is a mechanical device that's used to haul or lift things. Now, back to the job at. Once the engine was detached, the restorer wheeled it away and immediately turned his attention to the front section of the bike. One by one, he disengaged each component, from the tires to the speedometer and the fork. Of course, there was a bit of resistance because most of the screws and even some parts had rusted pretty bad. But it was nothing too serious. A bit of penetrating oil here and there solved the issue, and within a few minutes, all that was left of the front section of the bike was this. Impressive, right? Well, there wasn't much time to celebrate this milestone because a lot of work still had to be done on the rear. Just like he did in the front, the restorer had to apply penetrating oil here and on some other components. But generally, the entire process was pretty smooth, perhaps even more than we had expected. Within a twinkle of an eye, the bike had been reduced to a skeleton, which obviously showed that we were making progress. But we weren't there just yet. Before we can proceed to the next phase, this skeleton has to be dismantled even further until we have only bones left. And that's exactly what the restorer did. Once that was done and sorted, it was time to restore the components. Now, this is my favorite part of the restoration because it is where all the magic happens. First, the restorer rolled out the engine, and already you could tell that something interesting was on the offering. He rolled it out with so much confidence, it almost felt like I was watching the opening scene of a suspense-filled movie. Anyway, he eventually got down to business, but it wasn't long before we ran into our first major stumbling block. The restorer couldn't remove the camshafts because this chain right here was too tight. Thankfully, the restorer knew exactly what to do. He removed the camshaft tensioner to loosen the tension of the chain and also yanked off the camshaft cap. This ultimately fixed the problem. The camshafts came off without stress, and so did the cylinder head and every other part of the engine. But then, as the restorer worked her way around the engine, I noticed that most of the components had been riddled with carbon soot, and there was a tiny pile of dirt as well. Now, usually, these things are quite easy to clean. However, considering how long the bike had been abandoned, I wasn't expecting the cleaning process to be a roller coaster. Fortunately, I was wrong. All it took was some carb cleaner and hard brushing, and the stains came off with very little hassle. Next, the restorer soaked the engine head in a metal clean solution with the temperature set at 80 degrees Celsius. Then he proceeded to disassemble and clean the rest of the engine. While this was going on, he spotted another problem. The mounting part of the generator head of the crankcase was broken, creating yet another dilemma. At this point, I was really scared because if he's unable to fix this, then the whole restoration might just be jeopardized. But luckily, the restorer was able to mend it with Loctite epoxy putty before spraying the entire engine with 2 liquid urethane surfacer and a black paint. Next up, he cleaned the metal components with oil to avoid rust. Then it was time to reassemble the components. This was an intricate process that required some intricate and precise mechanical work, but our pro restorer was up to the task. At the end of it all, the engine was reborn and the before and after comparison was mind-blowing. I mean, nobody would have thought that an engine that looked like this a few moments ago could be revamped and restored to look like this. The transformation is remarkable, and I almost couldn't believe my eyes. But little did I know I was in for an even bigger surprise. As the restoration continued, the fork was thoroughly washed and rehabilitated. However, the Repro inner tube had to be replaced because the one that came with the bike was damaged beyond repair. Next up, it was time to give the frame a well-deserved facelift. First, the restorer gave it a thorough soap bath. Then, it was time to repaint it, but first, the old paint was removed using a paint remover and a scrapper. Finally, the new paint was applied, and the frame came looking sparkling, just like it was when it was manufactured several decades ago. At this point, the restorer decided to pause a bit and mount the engine back into the mini frame. This lasted a few minutes, but as soon as it was done, attention switched quickly back to the other components that were yet to be restored. This was a wholesome process that included some thorough washing, sanding, polishing, painting, and even rebranding. Yes, the restorer went out of his way to print new tags for some of the components, all in a bid to restore that brand new feeling, and it worked. By the time the tank was polished, painted, and unsealed, my mind was completely blown. I simply couldn't believe what I was seeing, and my excitement levels just hit the roof in anticipation of how the bike would look when it is reassembled. Speaking about that, the reassembly phase was very seamless because the restorer didn't have to deal with rusted screws and components. The process started from the rear, but things moved very quickly to the front, and in a twinkle of an eye, both tires had been installed. At this point, I was beginning to feel like the whole thing was to come together. But all of a sudden, the restorer noticed something awkward. The color of the swing arm looked a bit weird because it didn't have a black accent like the footrest and the wheel. If you ask me, I could have just continued with the work because only a few people would notice it anyway. But our perfectionist restorer wasn't going to let it slide. He unbundled the rear wheel, the fuel tank, and a host of other components just to add accents on the swing arm, and it was absolutely worth it. The styling of the swing arm automatically matched with the other components and accessories around it, and all that weird look from earlier immediately disappeared. Next up, the fork and every other thing in the front section was reassembled. The seat was returned to its rightful place, and then it was time for the moment of the truth. Given all the emotions I've had all through this restoration, one would think I've got nothing else left in my tank. But the reverse was the case. As the camera zoomed in on the restored bike, my memory flashed back to the very beginning, when this bike was just another piece of scrap. But just look at what it had become now, a fully restored motorcycle ready to take on the road again. Mere seeing it alone and hearing the engine roar to life, my heart was filled with so much emotion, from excitement to ecstasy. However, the crowning moment was when he revved it and zoomed off. I immediately felt a sense of fulfillment, knowing that all of that hard work had not gone to waste. I know I said something different earlier, but right now, I will have to change my mind and say, this is my favorite part of the restoration. With that said, what part of the restoration really caught your attention? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section, and don't forget to explore other restoration videos on the channel.